Hello everyone, welcome back. This is part 2 of our lecture series for chapter 25 in your textbook, Giving Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled The Kennedy Years. The focus question for this section is, what were the major crises and policy initiatives of the Kennedy presidency? John F. Kennedy was a Cold Warrior through and through. He really came to his political maturity after World War II, when the Cold War was just beginning to, well, heat up, if you will. And as such, he saw the entire world through this lens of the Cold War, this good versus evil paradigm. And as such, he aimed to counter communist influence in the world. One of the first efforts of Kennedy to do so was the notorious and infamous Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961. To preface this, Fidel Castro, this gentleman you see right here in this photograph, overthrew a U.S.-backed Cuban regime in 1959. In 1960, the Castro regime embraced communism and aligned itself with the Soviet Union. This, of course, was considered a very real and high threat to the Kennedy administration, having a communist country right on America's doorstep. And to counter this communist threat on the country's doorstep, Kennedy authorized a CIA-backed invasion and coup attempt in Cuba. The invasion spectacularly failed and was beaten back by Castro's military. And as such, tensions between the United States and Cuba increased dramatically, and it pushed Cuba ever closer to the USSR. Naturally, after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro became very paranoid that the U.S. would again attempt to overthrow his regime. So in 1962, at Castro's request, the USSR sent nuclear missiles to Cuba. These missiles were pretty quickly detected by U.S. spy planes, and after they were detected, the U.S. initiated a blockade of the island, trying to stop any commercial or military traffic to and from the island, and tried to negotiate with the Soviet Union. They asked the USSR to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a promise that the United States would not invade Cuba, and that the U.S. would remove their missiles from Turkey, which was one of the primary reasons that the Soviet Union desired to have missiles in Cuba in the first place, to counter and balance this threat that they faced from the American missiles in Turkey. This crisis quickly escalated and led to what was known as the 13 Days, where the USSR sent a fleet to break the U.S. naval blockade. And of course, the United States threatened to attack if the USSR fleet came near Cuba. For those 13 days, as this Soviet fleet was plowing through the Atlantic on its way to Cuba, the U.S. and the USSR stood on the brink of nuclear war as negotiations faltered. And the world was literally saved by a single Soviet naval officer who refused to follow orders when told to fire their missiles from the ship that he was on. This was the closest the world ever came to total nuclear war. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed, and at the end of this 13-day period, the Soviet Union agreed to rescind the fleet and turn it back to the Soviet Union, and the United States agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey and to not invade Cuba. Kennedy was so wrapped up in this Cold War paradigm that he essentially ignored civil rights issues until the events of 1963, such as the protests in Birmingham and, of course, the March on Washington, forced him to take a position on the issue due to the journalistic coverage, the televised coverage, and the public outcry that was a result of that coverage. Kennedy's excuse essentially for ignoring the civil rights issues prior to this was that he thought that the civil rights movement was backed by communists, which just goes to show how deeply embedded in this Cold War paradigm that Kennedy and his administration's thinking was. But as a result of the events of 1963, Kennedy called for a new civil rights bill. But before he could push that through Congress, he was assassinated on November 22nd of 1963. And this assassination led to one of the biggest controversies and mysteries in all of American history of who actually killed John F. Kennedy. Was it Lee Harvey Oswald, as the official story went? This Lee Harvey Oswald is the gentleman that you see here, who himself was assassinated by this gentleman, Jack Ruby, merely a few days after Kennedy's assassination. Jack Ruby, of course, had ties to the mafia, and John F. Kennedy was notorious for his anti-mafia policies and attempts to break the mafia's control and hold on organized crime in the United States. This has led many to posit and put forth theories that it was the mafia that was behind Kennedy's assassination. Others think that it was Castro and his regime that was somehow behind the Kennedy assassination. Oswald did have some ties to Castro in Cuba and actually had spent some time in Cuba in the early 1960s. And of course, even though the United States had agreed not to try to invade Cuba again after the Cuban Missile Crisis fiasco, that did not mean that the CIA stopped trying to assassinate Fidel Castro. And there have been at least 50 to 60 documented attempts by the United States on Castro's life in the 1960s. So that gives a little bit of credence to the idea that perhaps Castro as well was attempting, like Kennedy was, to assassinate his biggest rival. The mystery is still a mystery. There has been no definitive answer to this question, although the official line is that Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy and acted alone. Regardless, after Kennedy's assassination, he was succeeded by his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. And with that, we conclude part 2 of our Chapter 25 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.